Welcome back to another video on B. Richter's Movie Corner. Today I'm going to do the review discussion of Friday the 13th Part 2. I'm going to try to do this in maybe 2 parts instead of 3. So what I left on the last Friday the 13th is I talked about the whole, pretty much the whole movie, as well as my discussion about how I got into watching the horror films and the Friday the 13th series. Well, this I actually saw Part 2 on the same day as I saw the first one, and that was in 1989. This movie came out in 1981, which so happens that this year is his 35th anniversary. Directed by Steve Miner, who went on to do Part 3 and did Warlock and House and some episodes of Dawson's Creek, did Lake Placid, Halloween H2O. The list can go on and on. This was written by him as well, I believe. No, it was written by Ron Kurz. My first time I watched it, like I said on my other part, I had lied about watching Friday the 13th. Well, this one I had not lied about. I had never seen it, so I don't know what to expect in this. So when I put in the VHS and I started to watch it, the beginning of the Paramount logo came up, and then you see this young, I'm guessing it's a young girl, who's walking and splashing in the water saying, "Itsy bitsy spider," and all that kind of, that little rhyme that we used to know as a kid. And then you hear in the background, which sounds like Adrienne King's voice, yelling at the child to come in, and then as that girl walks off, you see somebody walking behind her. Now, I don't know if that was intentionalized to be Jason, but if you watch the end credits, there's a credit for a person called the Prowler. Now, I'm assuming that is who that is in the beginning of the movie. When I first saw it, I was thinking, well, this can't be Jason. He was in a camp. Why would he go to a town? Because this is like showing like a small little town with a bunch of houses. Anyway, you see Adrienne King in there, and she's having visions of and dreams of what has happened to her in the previous film, and showing about scenes in the movie and her chopping off Jason's mother's head and yeah. So basically, after she wakes up from all the flashbacks, she goes and takes a shower, and she hears the phone ring. Well, actually, the camera like pans into it, and she like moves the curtain real fast. But she hears the phone ringing, and it's her mom on the phone. So she starts talking to her mom about all the stuff, and then she gets off the phone and it rings. I think it rings like 1 or 2 more times, and nobody's on the other end. So she's not really thinking of anything. So she goes into the kitchen. She goes in there and she puts tea in a little tea kettle and puts it on the stove, and which actually you put water, not tea. But anyway, so she goes over towards. She hears like something over there by the window, and all of a sudden her cat jumps up out of her, and scares her, and so she opens up the refrigerator door, and there's Jason's mother's head, and all of a sudden she screams, she backs up, and then you see this hand grab up and stab her with an ice pick in the temple over her head there. So, and then she dies. So then it goes, so that after that scene, after the credits, you see a white screen, and then he goes to a red truck driving up on a road, and that's Jeff and Sandra driving in the car, which is played by Sandra played Marta Kober, and Bill Randolph played Jeff. And so they go to this town. By the way, before I get into any more, this was made in Westport, Connecticut. I guess they wanted to change the location instead of being in Blairstown, New Jersey. A lot of the scenes in the movie could be kind of like the same Camp Crystal Lake, but in reality, I believe it's like on the other side of the Camp Crystal Lake from the previous movie, just by the way it looks. Um, but as they go in there, they go to the payphone because they wanted to. They call Ted, which is played by Stuart Charno. I think he went by Stu in this movie, and as they're talking there, Sandra's this crazy Ralph, who happened to survive the first one, comes up and says, "You're all doomed," and he's still has the same old crazy thing on him about him. And while they're on the phone, some guy picks up their truck and starts towing it off, and they're like, "What the hell's going on?" So they drop the phone, run after him, and say, "This is my truck, you asshole." And he drives off, and then they realizing he's driving off to where Ted's at because they were going to go pick up Ted. And Ted says, "That's Max," and that's the guy who towed the truck, which happens to be a stunt coordinator and stunt man, Cliff Cudney. And they sit there not really argue, but he's joking around with him because Ted's like a joker in this movie. And before I get into all that, after I saw the beginning where Alice gets ice pick in the temple, I was like, okay, so now they finished off the person who survived, not counting Crazy Ralph, but the only person that survived, and now we're leading up to a new camp, a new scenario with what's going to happen now. So since Jason's mother has been beheaded, and then as they're going to the camp, Ted's telling them about a story about a bear and a rabbit, and as they go down to the road, they stop and they see like the Camp Crystal Lake like sign is like way out, and not way out, but kind of like thrown over to the side in these woods areas, and they stop there because I think the one girl had to pee or something like that. So she stops, they get out, and then they look at it, and Ted's telling them, "You don't want to go to that place." So as they're going, they go to the camp that they're going to, which is run by a guy named Paul, and he's played by John Fury. And in the midst of all this, his love interest, a girl named Jenny, start with a G, not a J, and that's played by Amy Steele. And she has trouble with her car, so she's trying to get it to start up, and Paul comes running over there and helps her out. But before all that happens, Paul's sitting there talking and telling them all about the arrangements of the camp and having to keep themselves clean and all this stuff. And you see other actors in the scene there. You see Tom McBride. He's the one in the wheelchair. His character's name is Mark. He happened to pass away. He happened to pass away in real life in 95, 96, something like that. And then you also see Vicky, played by Lauren Marie Taylor, who not long after this went on to the soap opera Loving. You see Scott, played by Russell Todd. You also see, Terry, played by Kristen Baker, she was a really cute young lady that she had played previous to this a TV show called James at 15, which they changed called James at 16. So basically, and then you have some other extra counselors in the background. I will get to that in a minute. So basically, they're all setting up the camp, and they're discussing about it, and it goes, and they're doing certain things like the one girl, Terry, she goes running into the woods, and Scott, he gets a slingshot and slings it right on her ass, and I mean, basically the whole storyline of this movie is definitely just leading up to another slaughter fest. So you got all these characters, you got all these camp counselors always opening up the camp, and so basically you don't know what's going on. I mean, because at the beginning of the movie, you see Alice get killed. Now you don't know if that's the prowler that you saw walking the street or if that was Jason, but you find that out towards the end of the movie exactly who it was. The setup was pretty interesting in my opinion, but so basically after all that happens, Sandra and Jeff actually want to go a little exploring because they want to go to the Camp Crystal Lake. And in the midst of them finding that, they actually see a dead dog, which there is a dog that one of the characters has, and they were going to tell him, but and while they're sitting and looking at it, somebody comes up behind them, and it actually is the cop, played by Jack Marks, and he hauls them out back to the camp, and Paul, who's the owner of the camp at this time, he's the head camp counselor, and he's telling him, well, aren't you going to have any punishment for him? And he says something like, don't let them have seconds for dinner tonight. Okay. So anyway, so basically the cop just kind of gives him a look, and he walks out, and he's driving, and as he's driving back, he sees this like person like run across the road there, and he starts running after him, and he goes to this little beat down like trailer kind of like shack, and he goes into it, and he's like, what is all this? And he looks into this one room, and he sees all this, and his eyes get real big, and he's like, what the hell? And then all of a sudden come up behind him, Jason, who as you would presume would be Jason, comes up and smacks him with the back of the hammer into the head, and he dies. Now if you watched Halloween 2, which also came out that same year, shows the scene where a cop security guard gets a hammer in the back of the head. Now I don't know if there was any inclination of anybody actually knowing that 2 movies with part 2 in the title that came out the same year are going to have a cop or security guard with a hammer in the back of the head. I don't know, but anyway, going on, you know, he's been dispatched. The cop has. So before I get into the other parts of the film, up to this point, I'm thinking, okay, this is actually going to be an interesting sequel. And I was glad that I rented the first 3 films so I could actually see, you know, because the final chapter was supposed to be like the end of the series, but obviously it wasn't. So going back to the story, after the cop has been dispatched, you have Sandra and Jeff, and then you have Vicky and Mark, and you have Paul and Jenny, and you have the extra counselors. They're all sitting there talking around. You have Terry and Scott as well, and Terry runs off, and Scott goes follow her, because they're all gonna, like, certain people are gonna go to this like bar, which some of the extra counselors. Now, before I get into the rest of the story, these extra counselors, they're not really, their names are not told in the movie. At the end of the credits, it just says extra counselor. Okay, you have an African American. You have, I believe, either Chinese or Japanese lady. You have a young girl with glasses, and I think you have another young African American in this movie. Anyway, their names are not said in the film. Now, I don't have a problem with that. The problem I have with is, if you're going to put some extra characters in the film, why not you just give them character names? I mean, that's just my opinion. I mean, granted, they didn't really have much of a speaking part in the film, but what was the whole point of them being in the film at all? Because they don't get killed. You don't see them get killed. All you know is that they go to this bar with Ted and Jenny and Paul. And anyway, so they all go to there, and Terry and Scott go off on their own, and then Vicky and Mark and Jeff and Sandra are all at the cabin. So Terry and Scott, they go off, and she goes skinny dipping into the lake, which actually, you know, shows pretty much everything that you do when you take off your clothes. You're pretty much naked. So Scott's over there. He takes her clothes, and she comes out, and she's coming after him. But in the midst of all that, there's like a rope on the ground, and he gets dragged upside down, and he's hanging upside down with her clothes in one hand, and she comes up there and she says, Scott, I'm going to kill you for taking my clothes. And he tells her, well, why don't you go get something to cut the rope for? So she goes running back to the cabin to cut the rope, and in the midst of her doing that, Jason ends up slicing his neck. Now, if you notice, and you could probably notice without even slow motion, that the knife is on the backwards part of the blade, not the sharp part of the blade. But, you know, what are you going to do when you've got somebody hanging upside down, and you don't want to have to stick a dummy because you want to be able to see him move around? And so she comes back, and then she says, if if you're joking, I'm going to kill you. So she moves his body a little bit because he was like covered to where he couldn't see it. And she sees him and she screams, and all of a sudden that's it. But you end up seeing her dead later in the film. And so it goes back to the cabin where Jeff and Sandra are at, and what's his name? Mark and Vicky are there. So while they're all there, they show the bar scene. Okay, so they're all at the bar, and the extra counselors are out there drinking and dancing or whatever. And you got Ted and Jenny and Paul just sitting at the bar table there, and Jenny's thinking about all the stuff that was said. Because what I forgot to mention is the very first night, Crazy Ralph is out there standing and watching Jenny and Paul in their room, and he ends up getting his like eroded like barbed wire hanging up down and kills him. I did forget to mention that. So she's thinking about, because she had heard all the stories about Jason. Now that was a scene that I didn't mention yet because I wanted to get to this part. Now there was a scene in the movie that has all the counselors all sitting at a campfire and Paul is telling the story about Jason Voorhees. And so in the midst of, and then he starts to think, he moves away a little bit, and he may still be out there, and all of a sudden Ted comes jumping up with a mask on him and a spear. So yeah, that was why in this scene, Amy Steele, Jenny, was talking about, what if Jason is real? What if he's still alive? And Paula and Ted are like, yeah, you're crazy. There is no Jason. So Jenny wants to go back. So Jenny and Paul leave with Ted there and all the extra counselors. So you don't know anything ever happened to any of them because they never show back up in the movie. They drive back to the cabin, but before they get to the cabin, Jeff and Sandra said they want to go and have a little premarital sex, and they want to go up into their room. So they go up into the room, and they start to have sex. All right. So Vicky and Mark are nowhere to be found. But before all that happens, it shows Vicky. They had went upstairs, Jeff and Sandra. So Vicky and Mark are downstairs, and he's in a wheelchair, and she's really likes this guy. So she wants to go get all nice and spiffy and really look good for him. So she goes off to her cabin, and he rolls out to the back side of the cabin. So when he rolls out the back side of the cabin, he's just sitting there in his wheelchair, and all of a sudden a machete just goes right through his face. And an interesting way of editing is he falls back off of he falls onto the steps with his wheelchair rolling down the steps without it flipping over, which was a pretty interesting feat to do on a wheelchair going backwards on a step. And so she doesn't realize he's dead, and she's still getting all dressed up and all that. So Jeff and Sandra are up there, and they're having sex. Now the one scene for this now leads up to where Twitch of the Death Nerve, a movie by Mario Bava from the 70s, shows where two people are having sex, and then a spear goes jamming right into their back, into the bodies of both of them. I don't know if the creators of this movie saw that film and was inspired by that, so they put it in the film. But anyway, so they get killed, and Vicky comes back in there and sees them both killed, and she walks in there and starts talking, and she lifts up the sheet, and they're both dead, and there's Jason sitting right there beside her. He slowly comes after her and then kills her. Now I'm going to stop it here and continue on to the next part. So thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. I will catch you on part 2 of Friday the 13th, part 2.